Imagine a chess game that transitions into an equal and boring endgame by move 10. Naturally, you would expect a quick draw agreement, but that wasn't the case in today's game between Bent Larsen and Bobby Fischer. What Fischer does is pure genius. In a single game, he uncovers a series of deep strategic ideas and unexpected tactical tricks, transforming a quiet endgame into a true masterpiece. So let's dive in and see if you can uncover the brilliance move by move. Larsen starts with d4 and Fischer plays the king's Indian defense, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, bishop g7, e4, d6. Larsen goes for the classical system, developing the king side in the most natural way, bishop e2, and after Fischer castles, knight f3. Fischer challenges white's domination of the center with e5. It might seem that white can win a pawn by capturing on e5 twice, but that isn't the case. After d takes e, d takes c, the exchange of the queens and knight takes e5, it turns out that black can get the pawn back as knight takes e4 comes with the discovered attack on the knight, and after possible knight takes, bishop takes, the position is absolutely equal. So white doesn't capture on e5, instead the main line is short castle. And Fischer develops the knight, putting more pressure on d4, creating an immediate threat of e takes d, knight takes d4, and again the knight would be on d4, so black can capture on e4 with the discovered attack on the knight. So black is going to win a pawn. So white must do something about this threat, and the main line is of course d5, crossing the center of the board, getting the space advantage on the queen side, and after knight e7, white prepares the expansion on the queen side, while black in his turn moves the knight away from f6, unblocking the f-pawn, pushing it forward, and launching an attack on the white king. But this wasn't the case in our game. So it seems that Larsen didn't feel like playing this sharp position arising after d5, so instead, as his d4 pawn is under attack, he plays bishop e3, a quieter continuation, defending the d4 pawn. Now black could have harassed the valuable bishop by playing knight g4, or as Fischer does in our game, he can play also rook e8, putting more pressure on the e4 pawn, indirectly attacking it. So black threatens to capture on d4 with the discovered attack on the pawn, so the pawn will fall after that. So white must do something about this threat. If he plays natural d5 this time, now that the rook is on e8, the knight doesn't have to retreat. Instead, it can jump on the great central square, eyeing the bishop. Black is ready to capture, getting the advantage of two bishops, and if white captures, then after e takes d, bishop takes d4, black gets the pawn back, and after possible exchanges of the light pieces, the position is absolutely equal. Maybe even black is slightly better because white's bishop is bad, it's restricted by its own pawns on the light squares, while the black bishop is good. The black rook is active, and the black king is closer to the center, which might be quite important after the exchange of the queens. So for this reason, instead of d5, Larsen makes a stronger move. He captures on e5 and transitions into the endgame, exchanging the queens and hoping to exploit his slight advantage in the endgame. Of course, capturing with the rook is more natural. It might seem that black can get in trouble after possible bishop g5, pinning the knight and threatening knight d5, which would attack the pinned knight for the second time and also attack the c7 pawn. But in this case, black can simply unpin his knight with rook e8, and after possible knight d5, black can capture, and after c takes d, the knight jumps on d4, attacking the bishop, and after possible knight takes d4, e takes d, white can put pressure on the half-open c-file, black in his turn puts pressure on the e4 pawn, the position has simplified and it's more or less equal. And it seems that Fischer didn't feel like playing this simple position, so probably he wanted to keep his winning chances alive, so instead of natural rook takes d8, he captures with the knight, knight takes d8. However, the knight on c6 used to defend the a7 pawn. So now that it's defended only by the rook, Larsson invades the b5 square, not only attacking the c7 pawn, which is his main threat, of course, capturing it with the fork, but also attacking the a7 pawn for the second time. Fischer defends the c7 pawn, knight e6. Now the pawn is defended, and it turns out that the white knight on c3 actually defended the e4 pawn, so now capturing on a7 would be a mistake, because black in his turn would capture a much more valuable central e4 pawn, so Larsson plays knight g5 first, defending the pawn and creating a new threat. He wants to exchange the e6 knight, which defends the c7 pawn, and after the exchange, again, the c7 pawn will fall. That's why Fischer defends it with rook e7. So, black has defended the c7 pawn, and if white captures on e6, then after bishop takes e6, again, white doesn't have time to capture because his central pawn is under attack, and after possible f3, c6, so capturing on a7 doesn't make any sense because the knight would be trapped from a7. It won't be able to return to b5 because the c6 pawn controls this square, so it must retreat and the position would remain equal. So this was possible. Knight takes e6 was possible, but it doesn't give white any advantage. But what if white captures on a7? Why did Fischer let his opponent do it? What happens if white captures this pawn? You can pause the video and find Fischer's possible reply. So, at first sight, knight takes a7 is a strong move because white wins a pawn, and also he's ready to exchange his knight for a valuable light-squared bishop. But actually, knight takes a7 would be a dubious decision because black has a strong move, knight f4. White doesn't have time to capture the bishop because black is threatening knight takes e2, which would come with a check. So, white must do something about this threat. If he captures, which looks like the most natural thing to do, then after e takes f, it turns out that black has great compensation for a pawn. He already had some compensation because the a file opens for his rook is active. Besides that, after e takes f, the bishop turns into a monster, the rook's file opens, so the e4 pawn also falls under attack, and black gets great activity. For example, also the knight is under attack, as the bishop which used to defend it has disappeared, so white can capture. But after rook takes c8, so the pawn is under attack, white must defend it, but the rook returns to a8, putting pressure on a2. White can play a3 in order to untie his rook, but knight d7, opening the bishop's diagonal, attacking b2, and after possible rook b1, the bishop invades the d4 square with a check, so it attacks both. It puts pressure both on the queen side and the king side, and after king h1, black can kick the knight out. The f4 is under attack, but black can defend it, so the knight is also on the edge of the board, it's passive. The bishop is bad, it's restricted by its own pawns. The rook is tied to the defense of b2. This rook isn't doing much, and let's say after possible rook d1, black can play c5, defending his bishop. Black, so just compare the pieces, all black pieces are much more active than the white pieces. The black knight has a great blockading square, while the white knight cannot move. Besides that, black is going to play f5, putting more pressure on white's position. So black definitely has a very good compensation for a pawn. For this reason, Larsson doesn't capture on a7. Instead, he makes a stronger move. He plays rook d1, eyeing the d8 square. At the moment, the knight, of course, controls this square, but let's see what happens next. Now Fischer, as his a7 pawn is still under attack, he decides to defend it by playing b6 to solve the problem of this pawn once and for all. And in his annotations, Fischer recommends knight takes e6, bishop takes e6, and f3, defending the pawn, after which the position would remain equal. But Larsson didn't feel like playing this line, because black pieces are cramped. As you see, the knight stands in front of the bishop, so Larsson didn't want to help his opponent develop his pieces by exchanging on e6. Instead, he finds a much more imaginative way to increase his initiative. So he sacrifices a pawn. He pushes the pawn forward to c5, right under attack of the black pawn and the knight. The idea is to vacate the c4 square for the bishop. So when the white pawn was on c4, this bishop was bad, but now it gets more prospects on c4. The bishop would be much more active. Besides that, the rook might be very active after rook c1 and possible c takes b. The c file would open for the rook. Or white can even push the pawn forward to c6 in order to restrict black even more. So Fischer decides to capture on c5. If he captures with the pawn, that wouldn't be a good idea actually, because white would exchange on e6 this time, and after bishop takes e6, white gets the pawn back with a tempo, attacking the rook, and after rook d7, white can, as his pawn is under attack, defend the pawn, and black remains with two isolated weak pawns. So white is definitely better. That's why Fischer, of course, captures with the knight. But the knight also used to keep an eye on the d8 square, so that was another idea behind Larsson's sacrifice. After knight takes c5, his rook invades the 8th rank and becomes very active. Rook d8 check. Black would love to play rook e8 in order to exchange this active rook, but that doesn't work, because after rook takes e8 check, knight takes e8, it's true, the knight defends the c7 pawn. White cannot capture it, but now the c4 square tells bishop c4, threatening to capture on f7. And after possible bishop e6, knight takes e6, knight takes e6, the bishop, which used to be white's worst piece when it was placed on e2 and restricted by its c4 pawn, now turns into white's best piece, bishop d5, attacking the rook. The rook must move. Now it doesn't defend the pawn anymore, white gets the pawn back, and he's better. He has the advantage of two bishops, and his pieces are more active than the black pieces. For this reason, after rook d8 check, instead of rook e8, Fischer plays bishop f8. And Larsson gets the pawn back. Knight takes a7, also attacking the bishop, threatening to win a piece. That's why Fischer captures the knight. Larsson, in his turn, captures the bishop, and Larsson has got the pawn back, and he also gets the advantage of two bishops now. It might seem that black can win a pawn, as both his knights are attacking the pawn, but capturing the pawn, of course, would be a terrible blunder, because the rook is very active, the bishop on f8 is pinned, so after knight takes e4, knight takes and knight takes, black wins a piece, but his king gets checkmated. There is no defense against rook takes f8 checkmate. For this reason, of course, Fischer doesn't capture on e4. Instead, he plays king g7, unpinning his bishop and taking the h6 square under control, and now he threatens to capture on e4. Larsson, of course, could have captured the knight, and Fischer also recommends this in his annotations. After bishop takes c5, black must capture with a pawn. Now his pawns are doubled and weak, and white's a-pawn turns into a passed pawn. However, it also has its drawback. White gives up the bishop pair. Besides that, we have the position with opposite colored bishops, and that means most probably the game would end in a draw, so black's winning chances reduce. Besides that, black still threatens h6, kicking out the knight, followed by knight takes e4. So it seems that Larsson wanted to keep his winning chances alive. So instead of giving up the bishop pair, he, as his pawn is under attack, he defends it with f3. Knight e8 follows. The knight is heading to d6 in order to kick the rook out of c8. And the a2 pawn is defended by the rook, so the rook is tied to its defense. So in order to untie his rook, Larsson plays a3. And knight d6 attacking the rook moves to d8, and Fischer kicks the knight out of g5 with h6. Here Larsson had the last chance to capture on c5. Probably that was a better idea, as Fischer also indicates, but again Larsson doesn't want to exchange his valuable bishop, and he simply retreats the knight, and now Fischer retreats his knight to e6, attacking the rook. Rook b8, and finally Fischer exchanges this active rook. Rook e8, and white has no choice, he must exchange the rooks. Rook takes e8, knight takes e8. And it turns out that white's initiative has faded away, and Larsson struggles to find an active plan. Probably he should have brought back the knight into play via f2, but he plays bishop b5, attacking the knight. But as Fischer writes in his annotations, this move proves to be pointless because of simple knight d6, activating the knight with a tempo, attacking the bishop, and the bishop retreats to f1. And we have reached another critical position. At first sight, it might seem that white still has a slight advantage on account of his bishop pair, but actually the opposite is the case. It's black who has a slight advantage. It turns out there is a serious weakness in white's position. You can pause the video, detect this weakness, and find the most effective way of exploiting it. The dark squares, especially the d4 square, is weak. White doesn't have the c-pawn anymore to take this square under control. And the black knight is eyeing this square. But if the knight invades, white has the defender of this square, so the bishop can capture the knight. That's why it's a good idea for black to exchange the dark squared bishops first. So Fischer plays knight b7, opening way for his bishop to c5. So he wants to exchange the bishops, and after that his knight will invade the great d4 square, and the knight will dominate the whole position. There is nothing white can do to prevent this. If he tries to prevent it with b4, taking the c5 square under control, it turns out that the pawn is actually pinned, and black can simply capture on b4. White cannot recapture because he loses the rook. So after knight b7, Larsson brings the knight back into play with knight f2, and of course bishop c5 follows. Attacking the bishop. If white avoids the exchange with bishop d2, his bishop will be passive, and the black bishop will invade d4, and it will dominate. So the bishop is pinning the knight, it attacks the pawn. After rook b1, so the rook is tied to the defense of the pawn, the knight is pinned, white pieces are passive, and black increases his pressure with knight c5. Black pieces are much more active. So the best thing white can do is to exchange the bishops. Bishop takes c5 and knight takes c5. So this knight is going to invade d4, and this knight is already greatly placed on c5. And white can either tolerate the knight on c5 or kick it out with b4, but b4 also has a serious drawback. Of course, the knight will retreat from c5, but after b4, the a3 pawn will be weak, and the activity of the black rook will increase, and the white rook will be tied to its defense. So it's understandable that Larsson doesn't want to play b4. Instead, he occupies the only open file with rook d1. And we have reached another critical position. So black exchanged the dark squared bishops to occupy the d4 square with the knight. But invading this square right away would be premature. You can pause the video and find white's strong reply to the immediate knight d4. And if you find white's reply, you will easily find the brilliant move Fischer made instead of knight d4. So, black would love to play knight d4 right away, but in this case, white has a strong reply knight g4, attacking the e5 pawn. After black defends the pawn, white has another strong move, f4, undermining the knight. So white is threatening to capture on e5 twice, winning a pawn. And black, of course, cannot capture on f4 because he's losing the knight. So what should black do after that? If he, let's say, captures on e4, winning a pawn, white immediately gets the pawn back and black has lost his advantage. The position is absolutely equal. Or if after f4, if he plays knight c6, trying to reinforce the e5 pawn, then white can play bishop b5, activating his bishop, attacking the knight, and the knight must move. So the knight moves to d4. White doesn't have time to capture on e5 because the bishop is under attack. The bishop can return, and the game can end with the repetition, can end in a draw by repetition. So now that we know that knight d4 runs into knight g4, we can easily find Fischer's deep strategic move, prophylaxis. He plays h5 first. There is no need to hurry with knight d4. First, he prevents knight g4. As he writes in his annotations, Nemcovich would be glad to see this move. What should white do? Knight d4 is coming. Fischer, in his annotations, recommends knight d3. But it's understandable that Larsen disliked the position after the exchange of the knights. So after bishop takes d3, knight d4, we can see that black has a great knight against not so great bishop. So the bishop can be considered bad as it's restricted by its own pawns. So black has a slight advantage and only black has winning chances in this position. And of course, Larsen didn't want to play this position. He was an ambitious player. So he tries to get some activity. Rook d5. The rook invades, attacking the pawn. King f6, Fischer defends the pawn. And Larsen blockades the king side with h4. And we have reached another critical position. What should black do next? Of course, the first thing that comes to mind is knight d4 again. But in this case, after knight d4, the white rook remains on d5 and it's very active. The knight has moved away from e6 and it doesn't control the d8 square anymore, so this square is available for the white rook. And let's say after possible knight d3 and after the exchange of the knights, white has a threat. He can play f4. Again, undermining the knight. So with f4, white would attack the e5 pawn for the second time, and black won't be able to capture on f4 because he's losing the knight. So black can try c6 to defend against this threat, to kick the rook out so that it doesn't attack e5 anymore. But rook d8. Of course, the black knight is more active than the white bishop, is better, stronger than the white bishop, but the white rook in its turn is stronger than the passive black rook. So the position is more or less equal. So what else can black do? Knight d4 right away doesn't give him any advantage. Another idea is c6, to kick the rook out, but on c7, the pawn controls the d6 square, and after c6, the rook can invade d6, attacking the weak c6 pawn. And after black defends it, now his rook becomes passive and it isn't putting pressure on a3 anymore. So white can play b4 now, kicking out the knight. So the knight must retreat from the great square, and black's domination comes to an end. So neither knight d4 nor c6 gives black advantage. So what should black do then? How should he kick the active rook out of the d5 square? You can pause the video and find Fischer's brilliant idea. So it might seem that the king is tied to the defense of the e5 pawn, but actually it isn't the case. Fischer plays king e7, taking the d6 square under control and leaving the pawn unguarded. And it turns out that the pawn is actually untouchable. After rook takes e5, black plays c6, taking the d5 square under control, and the rook is trapped. It doesn't have any square to move. All these squares are under control, under black's control, and f6 is coming, after which the rook would be lost. So the idea behind king e7 is taking the d6 square under control, and now c6 is coming, after which the rook won't be able to invade the d6 square. Larsson activates his bishop, and c6 follows. So, as you see, all these squares are under black's control. The rook must retreat, and only now, finally, knight d4 follows. The knight is great, and besides that, the knight is closing the d-file, making the white rook passive. So, what should white do now? Fischer recommends knight d3, but again, it's understandable that after knight takes d3, bishop takes d3, again, Larsson didn't want to play this position because the black knight is much stronger than the white bishop and the white rook is passive. So, Larsson instead plays king f1, bringing the king closer to the center. In the endgame, the king belongs in the center. And we have reached another critical position. How should black increase the pressure? I will give you a small tip. With his next move, Fischer exploits the drawback of white's last move, king f1, to create another weakness in the enemy position. So, at the moment, the e4 pawn is well defended. It's defended by the knight and, which is more important, by the f3 pawn. So Fischer wants to undermine this pawn. So he's going to make this pawn weak. He attacks it with f5. And it turns out that if white captures on f5, now we can see the drawback of king f1. Black captures with the knight, threatening knight e3 with a fork. And besides that, the h4 pawn is under attack, so black is winning material. For this reason, as e takes f doesn't work, Larsson plays b4, attacking the knight. Of course, he weakens, permanently weakens the a3 pawn, and the pawn turns into a target of the black rook. But Larsson has a point. If the black knight retreats, let's say if black plays knight d7, the knight doesn't put pressure on e4 anymore, and white can simply defend his weak a3 pawn. Black is still better, but at least there is no pressure on e4, and e4 pawn isn't isolated. If black captures, that would be a serious strategical mistake, because, of course, instead of capturing with the pawn, white will capture with the knight, and black has an isolated pawn, and white gets a great centralized knight. So, after b4, that was Larsson's idea. He wanted the black knight to retreat. So, how did Fischer react to b4? You can pause the video and find his brilliant tactical trick. So it might seem that f takes e is a right idea. F takes e right away. with the idea of B takes C and E3 with a fork. Black gets the material back, but it doesn't work because white captures on B6, attacking the rook. And white is winning. So let's say after e takes d, white captures on a7 and promotes to the queen. And if rook b7 instead, then white defends his pawn, and after black gets the piece back, white pushes the a pawn forward and he wins. Black is losing. But Fischer implements the same idea, but in a more correct way, so more precisely. So first, before capturing on e4, he plays b5, moving the pawn away from b6 with a tempo, so that after possible b takes c, the b6 pawn and the rook as a result doesn't fall under attack. And it turns out that white cannot capture the knight. If he does that, then after b takes c, the a3 pawn is under attack. It will fall. The c pawn turns into a passed pawn. It will move forward, supported by the knight. So black is winning. For this reason, after Fischer's move, b5, the only thing white can do is to move the bishop. So he moves it to g8, and only now that the black pawn isn't on b6, does Fischer capture on e4, while his knight is still on c5. He captures on and puts pressure on e4, he captures on e4. So what should white do next? If he captures the knight now black's idea works. After e3, black gets the piece back, and no matter what white does, he gets a terrible position. Let's say if he captures the knight, then after e takes d, black gets connected passed pawns, and after knight d3, rook takes a3, the b pawn also turns into a passed pawn, and black is winning. If white plays rook a2, defending the a3 pawn, then black gets the piece back, and after king takes f2 and king f8, it turns out that the bishop is trapped. So all the squares it can move are controlled by black. e6 by the knight, these squares by pawns, and this square again by the great knight. So the bishop is lost. And finally, if rook d3, again defending the pawn, then again black gets the piece back, and after king takes f2, rook a8, attacking the bishop. So if the bishop moves to h7, again it gets trapped after king f7. If it moves to b3, it closes the rook's way. The rook doesn't defend a3 anymore, and black captures it. And finally, if the bishop moves to a2, then e4, the pawn is pinned as the bishop would fall. So next move, black will simply capture on a3 with the rook and win. For this reason, after f takes e, as white cannot capture with the knight either, because black would simply exchange the knights and capture on a3, winning a pawn. So after f takes e, white must capture with a pawn. And only now that the knight has successfully completed its mission, the e pawn is isolated and weak, now Fischer retreats the knight to d7. And the pawn is under attack, so Larsen defends it with rook d3. So Fischer would love to play knight c2 now. White's main weakness is a3, it's attacked once, so with knight c2 he would love to attack it for the second time. But knight c2 right away would run into possible rook c3 with the double attack. That's why first Fischer defends the c6 pawn with rook a6, preparing knight c2 next move. And for this reason, Larsen prevents it with rook c3. So we have reached another critical position. What next? How should black increase the pressure? You can pause and find another unexpected combination by Fischer. he spots that white actually has back rank issues. The only square the king has, the e2 square, is controlled by the knight, and if only black could check, that would be deadly. So he pushes the pawn forward. c5, threatening to push the pawn to c4 and creating a protected passed pawn. And it turns out that if white captures the pawn to prevent this, then b4 would follow, attacking the rook and the pawn, and white cannot capture on b4 because the a file would open and the check would be deadly. White would be forced to give up the knight, and black is winning. So how should white react to c5? Probably the best move would be, as Fischer writes, would be b takes c still. It looks, of course, dangerous, but it's still the best, white's best chance. And after b4, of course, white shouldn't capture. Instead, he should retreat the rook to the first rank to defend it. And now it isn't so easy for black to win this position. He must find the most precise move. If he, let's say, captures on a3, hoping to push the pawn forward, white can simply blockade the pawn, and black only has a slight advantage. It isn't easy to convert this advantage. If instead of b takes a, black captures on a3 with the rook, that would be even worse, because the white pawn is also very dangerous. So white can push the pawn forward, attacking the knight. If the knight moves to f6, attacking the bishop, white is even winning, because after c7 there is no way to stop the pawn. So after c6, black must play knight b6, controlling the promotion square of the pawn, and after c7, king must move to d7 to prevent the promotion, but in this case white plays bishop f7, attacking the weakness on g6, and the position is equal. So black must play carefully. Neither b takes a nor rook takes a3 gives him advantage. There is only one correct move, knight f6, moving the knight away from d7 so that c6 comes without a tempo. With a tempo, the knight also attacks the bishop. So after the bishop, let's say, retreats to c4, attacking the rook, now black can, now that the white pawn cannot move forward, now black can capture on a3. So if c6, of course, the knight captures it. And if instead of bishop c4, the bishop moves to a2, black can even push the pawn forward with a tempo, attacking the bishop, and then capture on a3. So c6 wouldn't be dangerous because the black king is right on, it comes without a tempo, c6 comes without a tempo, and the king is right on time to stop the pawn. So this pawn is doomed, this pawn is very strong, the bishop is hopeless, so black is winning. But of course all this was too complicated, and as Fischer writes, Larsen was in time trouble. So after Fischer pushed his pawn forward to c5, so the king has back rank issues, so Larsen plays g4 in order to solve the king's problem, the back rank problem, once and for all, vacating the g2 square for the king. But now Fischer, of course, pushes the pawn forward and gets the protected passed pawn. G takes h follows. So black is going to play knight f6 with a tempo. That's why Larsen moves the bishop away from g8 in advance, bishop d5, knight f6 still follows, and rook g3, activating the rook, and probably Larsen hopes to invade g7. But Fischer simply captures on d5. After e takes d, of course the d5 pawn is weak. On the other hand, the white knight, the passive knight, gets a great blockading square, but Fischer prevents this, the invasion of the white knight. Rook f6, pinning the knight. Larsen unpins the knight, renewing the possible threat of knight e4, but knight f5. Fischer doesn't give him time to do it. The rook and the pawn are under attack, that's why Larsen plays rook h3. Now his rook is passive and it's tied to the defense of the pawn. And now that the rook has been kicked out of g3, Fischer activates his rook, rook g6, check, occupying the g file. King f3, knight d4, check, king e3, and the rook invades g2. Tying the knight. The knight cannot move. If it moves, rook e2, checkmate would follow. Suddenly it turns out that the white king is in the mating net. So, and the king cannot move either, as the knight would fall. So, white has only rook moves. So, he moves his rook to h1. And king d6, attacking the pawn. Knight e4 now is possible because it comes with a check. Black has no time to checkmate the white king, so the king captures on d5 and knight c3 check. King e6. So now black threatens to play rook c2, kicking out the knight, and after the knight moves from c2, the black rook will move to e2 with checkmate. That's why rook c1, defending the c2 square. But the rook on h1 defended the h4 pawn, and now rook h2, attacking this pawn. a4, Larsson is desperate, so he tries his last chance. He wants to make his b pawn, to turn his b pawn into a passed pawn. Rook h3 check, however, follows. King f2, and knight b3, attacking the rook. And the rook is tied to the defense of the knight. And if it moves to c2, that's the blunder. After rook h2 check, the rook falls. So the only thing Larsson can do is to counterattack the black rook in his turn, king g2. So the rooks are exchanged. Knight takes c1, king takes h3, b takes a, knight takes a4. The knight controls the c3 square, so the black pawn cannot move, and the white pawn also turns into a passed pawn, but knight e2, taking the c3 square under control and preparing c3. b5, c3, b6, c2, and it turns out that white cannot push the pawn forward because after the promotion, white also promotes, but he gets checkmated. That's why after c2, white must stop the pawn. So Larsson plays knight c5 check, king d5, knight b3. But king c6, the white pawn is stopped, king g2, and Fischer captures on b6. And here Larsson resigned because after possible king f2, black simply promotes and he ends up with an extra piece and an extra pawn. So in this position, Larsson resigned. And now I recommend watching Fischer's black magic in action. But first, I'd be grateful if you like this video and subscribe, as it's really helpful for the channel growth.